So it is my pleasure to be introducing to you Dr. Raihan Ismail, who's an ARC DECRA Fellow and a senior lecturer at the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at ANU. That's Australian National University, for those of you who don't live in Australia. She was the co-recipient of the Max Crawford Medal in 2018, awarded by the Australian Academy of Humanities for outstanding achievements in the humanities by an early career researcher. She has been studying, researching, working on political Islam, sectarianism, and the nature of religion and politics in the Middle East. At the moment, she is working on her new book. She has a number of publications. At the moment, she's working on a new book looking at the transnational networks of Salafi clerics in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, which is to be published by Oxford University Press. So it's a pleasure to welcome Raihan to our MESEF webinar series. And today, Raihan was sharing with us her research on Salafism and how they can be mobilized to address some of the challenges posed by jihadism. Raihan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shahram, for having me and also for organizing the webinar. And thanks, Dara, for also, assisting me with Zoom in particular. I'm working, as Shahram said, I'm working on a book project on the transnational networks of Salafi clerics, mainly looking at Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. And this talk is actually part of one of the chapters. I'm submitting the book next week, the manuscript next week. So if you have any comments or suggestions, I'll be more than happy to talk about the research, and please let me know. So this talk today is on mobilizing Salafism against jihadism, but basically looking at the networks of Salafi clerics and how Salafi clerics in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia engage or deal with the question of jihadi Salafism. So we know that when we talk about Salafism, it is often blamed for providing the theological foundation for extremism or violent extremism. And Salafi creed and jurisprudence are accused of rigidity, promoting social conservatism and adhering to uncompromising attitudes towards those who fail to subscribe to, in the view of Salafis, authentic Islam. So in simple terms, it means emulating the pious ancestors, often referring to the first 3 generations of Muslims. However, scholars have remarked that Salafism is not a monolith. Those who work on Salafism rely on Horowitz's typology, and many, including US Wagemakers, have actually challenged this typology. I challenge this typology in other areas of Salafi creed, theology, social issues, sectarianism, and how clerics deal with sectarianism. But when it comes to jihadi Salafism, I think this typology reflects the Salafi fields. And despite the disagreements over the minor details of this categorization, the scholars generally agree that Salafis can be divided into 3 broad categories. One, the Quietists, those who denounce any form of political activism. They're also very supportive of the state. Activists or harakis, those who challenge the state but do not engage in violent activities. And the activist trend, largely emerged during the first Gulf War, following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And these activist clerics rejected Saudi Arabia's decision to allow US troops to be based on Saudi soil. So they challenged that decision. And they ultimately combined Muslim Brotherhood style activism with Salafi theology and jurisprudence. So very sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, but maintain their adherence to Salafi theology and jurisprudence. And finally, jihadi Salafis, those who promote violence to impose authentic Salafi ideals. And I don't look at the 3rd group in my research, but I look at the first 2 groups and how they engage with jihadi Salafism. So my research, I focus on the ulama, the clerics, men of religion or the clerics, because they are regarded as the preservers of Salafism, and they are influential actors within the Salafi circles. And both Quietists and activist ulama reject jihadi Salafism. To both Quietists and Harakis, jihadi Salafism represents a distortion of Salafi thought and deviates from the correct manhaj or the correct method of action. However, Salafi ulama, and this is where it becomes quite confusing, Salafi ulama do not necessarily oppose the legitimacy of jihad, and on many occasions, their passionate appeal for jihad has been mistaken for a collective call for an armed struggle. And this has made them, as a group, susceptible to intense criticism from non-Salafis. So how do Saudi Salafi ulama, Quietists and activists engage with the question of jihad? I think this is quite important. The support for Salafi ulama for armed struggle varies from one circumstance to another. And I actually argue that both Quietist and Haraki trends of Salafism have generally rejected the jihadi Salafi manhaj, which permits armed struggle against Muslim rulers and non-Muslim rulers. However, this does not mean that the ulama refuse to consider the necessity of jihad on certain occasions. They are most prepared to do so when it suits the geopolitical objectives of political benefactors, the state. And both activists and Quietist clerics, they still operate within the political system, unlike jihadi groups. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, for example, is the paradigm example of unanimous Salafi support for jihad in the name of defending Islam and Muslims. So it was not only the good jihad, but an easy jihad for the Salafi ulama. So from Kuwait, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, Salafi ulama were enraged with the Soviet invasion. And from the very beginning, the ulama would who would later be classified as Quietists in both Saudi Arabia and Egypt, categorized jihad in Afghanistan as fard al-ain, an individual obligation for Afghans, and fard al-kifaya, a collective obligation for non-Afghans. So this means that Afghans had an obligation to take up arms against the Soviets. Non-Afghans were required to assist their Afghan co-religionists. So in Islamic jurisprudence, fard al-kifaya obligates collective action on the part of all Muslims as they belong to the community of believers. And if enough Muslims perform the obligation, the remaining members of the ummah are not required to do so. So based on this reasoning, Afghan fighters had a religious duty to fight while other Muslims were encouraged to provide financial and moral support without having to travel to Afghanistan. So the ulama in the three countries did not speak out against foreign fighters because it was an easy jihad. It was pretty popular. They did not speak out against foreign fighters traveling to Afghanistan. And this is despite the fact that they were not actually supportive of the idea, because they believe that for non-locals, it is a collective obligation and not an individual obligation. But there are different views as well. Some Salafi ulama in Kuwait supported jihad as fard al-kifaya, encouraging non-locals to travel. Again, context is important to understand the debate among Salafi ulama regarding the Afghan war. As jihad in Afghanistan was popular, differences in the support for jihad as fard al-ain and fard al-kifaya did not produce the same hostility that was generated following the US invasion of Iraq or the Syrian civil war, which both contributed to the entrenchment of the Haraki Quietist divide. The early stages of the Syrian civil war or uprising and civil war, especially before the rise of ISIS, can be classified as easy jihad. The ulama had no difficulties speaking out against the Assad regime and endorsing armed struggle. And this is something that I'll be looking at later as well. So when it came to the US invasion or invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in the first decade of the 20th century, so the question of jihad was more controversial. So it was not that easy anymore. Salafism had been blamed for the recent 9/11 attacks. At that time, the Saudi state was under a lot of scrutiny as 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, and many Salafi ulama were conflicted, or at least refused to demonstrate their support for jihad publicly due to fealty to or fear of the governments of their respective state. Despite the fact that the Saudi state had earlier been being one of the first countries to endorse the Taliban as a legitimate government in Afghanistan, it did not hesitate to denounce and cut diplomatic relations with the Taliban after the US decided to invade the country on the premise that it harbored terrorists. So Kuwait and Egypt did not oppose the US as well. So the ulama were in a very difficult position. Quietist clerics in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, not in Egypt, but Saudi Arabia and Kuwait were nervous. On the one hand, they toed the government line. On the other hand, the US invasion of Afghanistan threatened Muslims in Afghanistan. As Madawar Rashid noted, since September 11, mosque imams have been prohibited from mentioning the USA by name in their supplication during Friday sermons, which traditionally include a denunciation of the enemies of Islam and a call for the victory of Muslims. So due to the pressure from the Kuwaiti government, Kuwaiti Salafis were in a similar predicament to their Saudi counterparts and were largely on the defensive following September 11. The Kuwaiti ulama, Quietist ulama in Kuwait, through RIHS, Quietist Association, articulated a defense of the organization in an article published in January 2002. So you can see what the article says, that dissociating themselves from Osama bin Laden and also denouncing other terrorist groups or jihadi groups. Egyptian Salafis, as I've said earlier, at that time they were mostly Quietists. They actively supported Afghans against the invaders and were highly critical of the US. So it must be noted that Egyptian Salafis were apolitical until 2011. They've always been apolitical. Some clerics embraced activism and participated in elections only after the fall of Mubarak, because they saw the post-Mubarak era as an opportunity for them to participate in elections. So Sheikh Mohammed Hassan, for example, a popular cleric who until 2011 was a known Quietist, highlighted the plight of the Afghan people and blamed terrorist elements for tainting the reputation of Islam. So Hassan proposed jihad in support of Afghanistan or of Afghans. However, he emphasized jihad through financial means and frequent vocal condemnation of oppression. So the approach of Egyptian Quietists was clearly different from the silence of Quietist clerics in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait. And this is despite their close relations with Quietist clerics in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, as they visited each other. We're talking about networks here, the transnational networks. They've always visited each other, organized conferences together, and appeared on each other's television programs. There is a possible explanation for this, why the Egyptians are not, are not as careful as the Saudis and the Kuwaitis. It can be argued that Saudi Quietists were part of the state's bureaucracy and under considerable pressure not to undermine the diplomatic position of the state. They've always been the state. The Saudi state supported the US by providing logistical assistance and was sensitive to any accusations of uncooperativeness, given that 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. Sorry guys, that's my coffee machine being a bit noisy. So Egyptian Salafis were not bound by the same expectations. So their relations with the state under Mubarak were informal. The state treated the Muslim Brotherhood with trepidation, but largely left the Salafis to their own devices to preach freely. Salafism was peripheral in Egypt. So, they said whatever they wanted to say. So the face of Egyptian Islam, at least propagated by the state, is Al-Azhar University, seen as the bastion of Sunni Islam. The same can be said about the US invasion of Iraq. Quietist ulama in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were largely nervous, they were pretty quiet, but not Egyptian quietists for reasons I've mentioned before. Activist clerics in the region were more vocal. These ulama questioned critically the US operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Nasr al-Barak, a prominent Saudi alim, Haraki alim, activist alim, issued a fatwa outlining his concerns. These clerics highlighted their disappointment with Muslim countries for their cooperation with the US. The prominent Kuwaiti activist cleric, Hakim al-Mutayri, argued in a number of articles in 2002 that the United States was committed to colonizing the region and drawing a new map of the Middle East to suit its interests. And another Kuwaiti-based Haraki, Hamid al-Ali, even flirted with jihadism in Iraq, as he did later in Syria. So he addressed the Iraq war in response to an identified questioner who asked, you can see the question there, someone's interested in traveling to Iraq, and he answered, if you have fighting skills and are confident that there are fields for combating the Crusaders, jihad is a better employment. And its objective is to expel the raiders from Muslim lands. It is not assistance to the state establishment. So the open political space in Kuwait allows Haraki ulama there to be less careful in voicing their opinions, unlike Saudi Arabia. And although Al-Ali was accused by Kuwaiti authorities of recruiting young men in Kuwait to fight in Iraq and later in Syria, the Kuwaiti state is less, or the Kuwaiti political system is more open in comparison to the other countries. It can be argued there were broadly three types of responses from the ulama in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia to the US-led invasion of Iraq. So first, some ulama were vocal in their condemnation and showed little reluctance to endorse jihad as fard al-ain. The Kuwaiti alim Hamid al-Ali did not even shy away from legitimizing armed struggle for non-Iraqis, a position most Harakis or most activists refused to endorse. So that's the first group. So those who said that go and fight in Iraq, it's not an issue. The second approach saw some ulama criticize the invasion and legitimize the jihad of Iraq, the jihad in support of Iraqis. However, they refrained from calling a collective jihad that would obligate all Muslims to participate. Most activist clerics took this position, including the Saudis Nasr al-Umar, Safar al-Hawali, as well as the Egyptian ulama such as Ishaq al-Huwaini and Muhammad Hassan. So to them, let the Iraqis fight, we support them, we promote jihad as a third category deals with those who were silent. They were mainly quietist clerics of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, voicing opinions within the boundaries established in the state. So what's interesting is that the three positions are largely shaped by the domestic circumstances, the ideological orientation of the cleric of the relevant country, as well as the relations of particular groups of ulama with the state. And more importantly, very limited transnational interactions among the ulama can be noted when discussing the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq by the US-led forces. And this could be explained by understanding the sensitivity of the subject of jihad in these conflicts. Although transnational relations between the ulama are strong in other areas, these ulama appeared reluctant to promote a uniform or collective position through cross-border religious gatherings, conferences, and other mediums on the plight of Muslims in the hands of the US-led operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this is radically different from how they engage with the Syrian civil war. Again, the Syrian civil war, the good jihad, or an easy jihad, as I've said earlier, it was not difficult to support the Syrian uprising or jihad in Syria. Salafi ulama have had long articulated disdain for the Alawites, the Hezbollah, and for Iran. And Salafi ulama of both activist and quietist persuasions spoke of the legitimacy of jihad in Syria. So Quietist Salafi ulama in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia endorsed jihad as fard al-ain for Syrians and fard al-kifaya for non-Syrians. So jihad was called within the framework of defensive jihad against a tyrannical regime. And Saudi Arabia's Grand Mufti Abdulaziz al-Sheikh in 2012 admitted the necessity of jihad in Syria, permitting Syrians to take up arms against the regime there. And this view was supported by Quietists in Kuwait and Egypt, including Uthman al-Khamis, Nasser al-Burhani, and other clerics. So the Haraki ulama was split when we talk about Syria. Between those who refused to endorse non-Syrian fighters, to those who were ambiguous, and those who expressly endorsed jihad for foreign fighters. Salman al-Auda belongs to the first camp. He argued that Syria should not be treated differently from Afghanistan and Iraq, reiterating his rulings forbidding foreign participation in those conflicts. So it's fard al-kifaya for non-locals. He outlined a number of reasons for his ruling, including that the Assad regime used the presence of foreign fighters to propagandize against its opponents. The Saudi Muhammad al-Arifi, or known as the Brad Pitt of Sheikhdom, apparently he's very good looking, that's why he's known as the Brad Pitt of Sheikhdom. So he belongs to the second group of ulama who were ambiguous on the subject. At times, he appeared to endorse jihad for non-locals, only to retract or resile from saying so when asked. So very confusing, he was a very passionate speaker. And third, those who expressly endorse jihad for foreign fighters verbally, Muhammad al-Zughbi, a popular and well-connected Egyptian alim, belongs to the third group. In a television interview on Salafi channel in 2012, al-Zughbi passionately called for all young Muslims to assist Syrians financially if they were unable to fight physically. He addressed young Muslim men as follows: "O young men of the Ummah, I'm with you, and we should all go to Syria to purify Syria from the infidel Nusayri regime, as well as the Shia from Iran, southern Lebanon, and Iraq." And Az-Zughbi and ulama who took similar views can be classified as militant harakis, and that's what I've been trying to do, trying to understand where they sit. Another cleric, a Kuwaiti cleric, Shaf al-Ajmi, also belongs to the third group. He was educated in Saudi Arabia, and he stated that he was preparing 12,000 fighters to be sent to Syria, and he implored jihadis in Syria to capture Hezbollah fighters alive and announced that we will enjoy their massacre. So of course he was later arrested by the Kuwaiti government after he returned from Saudi Arabia. So the point is, the clerics of the third group were always part of the Haraki network. So they're not, part of the jihadi networks. They're always part of the Haraki network. So they're activist clerics. They participate in the political process. So they do not endorse the overthrow of the Egyptian government or the Kuwaiti government or the Saudi government violently. And that's why when it comes to the jihad in Syria, they take a more militant approach, but they don't really belong to the jihadi Salafi movement. So I classify, as I've said earlier, these clerics as militant clerics. And despite the passionate rhetoric of some ulama and the lack of clarity on the subject of jihad, it can be concluded that Quietists and most Haraki ulama mostly dissuaded non-Syrians from taking up arms against the Assad regime, and this became more problematic later. And after ISIS became a significant regional threat and territorial occupier, attention internationally turned to Salafism as bearing responsibility for the group's doctrinal orientation. And this forced Salafi ulama to confront charges that they had provided moral and ideological support for jihadi groups and encouraged young men to travel to Syria and Iraq to fight. And repentant former jihadis, for example, returning from battlefields such as Syria, placed blame on the ulama. One ex-jihadi from Saudi Arabia argued that the speeches delivered by the ulama against Hezbollah, against Iran, against Bashar al-Assad, galvanized his fervor for the Syrian conflict, for the Syrian cause, compelling him to travel and support his co-religionists. He mentioned someone like Muhammad al-Arifi, the Brad Pitt of Shiithdom, as one of the clerics who passionately called for jihad. So the Salafi ulama responded by denouncing ISIS consistently, but their condemnation did not spare them from the accusation of inciting extremism. And these ulama began to construct counter-narratives against ISIS, and collaborative efforts by the ulama to absolve themselves from ISIS saw an increasing number of conferences, lectures, social media activities that were transnational in nature. The Saudi conference titled Islam is a Message of Peace and Moderation defended Salafism and condemned jihadi Salafism. Kuwaiti Salafis followed suit with a conference titled The Correct Understanding of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Participants presented methodical analyses of the origins of ISIS and its theological, jurisprudential, and political deviations. So there was a concerted and consistent effort by Salafis to dissociate their movement from the group. And this was necessary because of ISIS's claims to be an authentic Salafi group committed to the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Because when you look at ISIS, it holds the first Saudi state as an ideal Islamic state, which should be emulated. So the modern Saudi state is not really a true Salafi state, or not truly Islamic. ISIS theologians and propagandists accuse Quietists, Harakis, and even some jihadi ulama as either lackeys of tyrannical Arab rulers or deviant Islamists. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, ISIS is not fond of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is evident in ISIS's social media posts and publications. So Salafi ulama collectively question jihadi Salafis, especially ISIS. So these ulama condemn the use of takfir, declaration of infidelity of believers for not adhering to authentic Salafism, because ISIS would declare the infidelity of believers. So they argue that takfir is not part of the Salafi tradition, and this is the argument put forward by the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, for example. They also criticize jihadi Salafis for misinterpreting the concept of al-wala wal-bara, loyalty and disavowal. In brief terms, the concept can be defined as loyalty and disavowal for Allah. It emphasizes loyalty or wala to everything that is Islamic, and disavowal, bara, of everything that is un-Islamic. The modern interpretation of Salafi ulama indicate that al-wala wal-bara means Muslims must stay away from anything that is un-Islamic. For example, drinking, music, mingling with non-Muslims, congratulating non-Muslims on their religious celebration, such as Christmas, but not really to legitimize armed struggle against them. For jihadi Salafis, staying away from anything that is un-Islamic was no longer adequate to ensure bara. An active militant struggle was required to protect Muslims. Salafi ulama declare jihadi Salafi groups, including ISIS, as Khawarij, which is a breakaway group. The term was taken from the breakaway group that became extreme and assassinated the fourth Caliph Ali ibn Abi Talib. Similarly, the ulama collectively condemn ISIS fatwa, religious rulings, as barbaric and removed from Islam, including the immolation of the Jordanian pilot, enslavement of Yazidis, as well as using small knives to decapitate enemies. So there are a number of fatwas denouncing ISIS fatwa. The Quietist Salafis turn their fire also on Harakis for their political activism. So this is where, as I've said earlier, the threat of ISIS galvanized the divide between the Quietists and the Harakis. So the Quietists turn their fire also on Harakis for their political activism. The removal of Muhammad Mursi by the Egyptian government changed the tide in favor of Quietist ulama. Despite theological differences, Salafi Harakis have always sympathized with the Muslim Brotherhood. So now the Muslim Brotherhood is not there anymore. The Quietist ulama were largely absent during the Arab Spring uprisings, and and their activist colleagues celebrated the gains made by the revolutionaries. After the military takeover in Egypt, followed by the success of the counter-revolutionary forces in the region, Quietist ulama became bolder in their admonition of activism, especially Islamist activism. Quietist ulama extended definition of Khawarij to include non-Islamist movements, including the Muslim Brotherhood and activist Salafis. So Haraki Salafi clerics are accused of being Khawarij as well. The Kuwaiti Salim al-Tawil, for example, the Egyptian Saeed Raslan, the Saudi Saad al-Buraik, and Abdul Aziz al-Sheikh, either expressly or impliedly declared Haraki ulama as Khawarij, who had subversively encouraged dissension in the region. So with the rise of ISIS, they're just the same. They're like ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, just the same. So Raslan called them preachers of takfir, for example, naming someone like Safar al-Hawali, who's an activist cleric, Salman al-Auda, who's really quite a moderate activist cleric, Aid al-Qarni, Awad al-Qarni, as preachers of takfir. Raslan noted that al-Hawali had studied under Muhammad Qutb, who was the brother of Sayyid Qutb, and according to him, had corrupted al-Hawali's thinking against Ahl Sunnah. So they speak of the distortion of Salafism by both jihadis and harakis, and attribute the distortion to doctrine borrowed from the Muslim Brotherhood. So a small number of Salafi ulama have questioned aspects of the Salafi tradition in an honest attempt to come to terms with the movement's influence on ISIS. So Adil al-Kalbani is one of them, and he admitted that ISIS extracted its doctrinal understanding from, in al-Kalbani's words, our books. He also conceded that ISIS was an offshoot of Salafism, so not blaming the Muslim Brotherhood. He's saying that it was an offshoot of Salafism and not from other Islamists, including the Muslim Brotherhood or Sayyid Qutb. Al-Kalbani, for example, was a long time, for a very long time, one of the most vitriolic Salafi clerics on Sunni Shia sectarian matters, applying takfir to declare the infidelity of Shia ulama on the grounds of their corruption and distortion of Islam. But in 2009,
excuse me, Raihan.
Sorry, I'm almost done.
You're almost done. It'd be good to wrap up and allow time for questions. Thanks,
yes,
Raihan.
Of course. I'm getting
Apologies.
too excited. But there are other clerics as well, like Al-Awani, and these clerics argue that we can't just blame the Muslim Brotherhood. Our books have themes that are problematic, including the issue of al-wala wal-bara, the issue of takfir. So in conclusion, Salafi ulama have 3 points to make. Salafi ulama have differing attitudes towards jihad and how to deal with conflicts in Muslim societies. The attitudes vary from one circumstance to another. A number of factors influence how Salafi ulama engage with armed jihad in Muslim societies, which include, one, their relations with the state, nature of the conflict, easy versus controversial jihad, and the types of armed struggle. Second, Salafi ulama of both quietist and activist trends denounce jihadi Salafi doctrines and interpretation of Salafism. Concerted efforts are exhibited by these ulama to distinguish themselves from jihadi Salafism. The condemnation is transnational, but only along quietist activist lines, as the quietist ulama blame many activists for inciting dissension. And despite the almost uniform position towards jihadi Salafism, the threat of these groups has only revived and reinforced the enmity along quietist activist lines. And finally, the threat of jihadi Salafism has also created a group of clerics who call for the reassessment of Salafi tradition without rejecting the essence of Salafism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raihan. Apologies for cutting you short. That was amazing. You've covered a lot of ground, from jihad in Afghanistan all the way to conflict in Iraq and Syria, and you've made a very interesting connection between how ISIS is challenging the Wahhabi state in Saudi Arabia and what that means for the Salafi tradition in Saudi Arabia. So with those ideas, I'd like to open the floor to questions. We do have this function, and those of you may be more versed in the art of Zoom than I am, but I believe there is a button, a raise hand button. I think Anita has already used it. And if you do that, so well done, Anita, yes. So if you use that function, we'll see who's raised hand has questions in the right order as they appear. And then our wonderful Dara will unmute you and you can ask your question. So Dara, over to you.
Thank you. So our first question, or our only question so far, is from Abbas, who I'm going to mute. Maybe just quickly introduce yourself when you ask a question too.
Hello everyone, thank you. I'm Abbas Farasu from Deakin University, a PhD student. So my question is about, well, it's a comment and question. First, you started from examples from Afghanistan. So I have a little bit concern about this conceptual and methodological concern that you use Afghanistan, use terms such as Afghan Jihad. Mm-hmm. And after 2001, so we don't have such things as Afghan Jihad. So if we want to understand the reaction of these different groups to different cases such as Afghanistan and Iraq, we should be careful about the differences between Afghanistan and Iraq. And US invasion in Afghanistan is different under UN Charter Chapter 7. So that's totally different with Iraq, and there's nothing such as Afghan Jihad. There is a Taliban fighting against the government, and most of the people supported the government and even the US. So that's a difference between Iraq and Afghanistan. So we should be careful when we assess the reaction of these groups to different cases. So what is the reaction to different cases and how they understand and perceive these different cases? Second, the differences between these
Maybe
groups.
Maybe one question per person might be a good idea, just so that we don't run out of time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian.
Do I answer the question now? Or? Yeah, thank you, Abbas. I absolutely agree with you. I think in the chapter, I'm more careful when I discuss these issues. However, I'm looking at what the clerics say and how they describe and the narrative used by the clerics when they talk about the Afghan jihad. And they call it the Afghan jihad. So that's why the clerics, they approach it differently. But definitely that's something that I do recognize when I am writing this chapter. I've written the chapter, so hopefully I'll be able to submit it. But thank you very much. I'll reread it again and make sure that I'm very careful with how I frame the Afghan jihad or U.S. invasion in Iraq.
Thank you, Raihan. Next up, we've got Oz Malik.
Hi, Raihan. Thank you so much for your talk. My question, I'm not sure if it's related to your talk too much, but I was just wondering what's the intersection between Wahhabism and Salafism, and what's the difference, especially when it pertains to jihadism?
Yeah, thank you, Oz. So Salafism, most Saudis or Wahhabis, they claim to be Salafis. For the Wahhabis, they believe that Wahhabism is a derogatory identification of Wahhabi ideals. So Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab fostered relations with Ibn Saud, established the first Saudi state in 1744, and most opponents of the first Saudi state call them Wahhabis because they're not really Salafis. They claim to be Salafis, but they're extremists. So today, if you look at Salafism, you can say that Saudi interpretation of Salafism is the face of modern Salafism today. So the ideals in terms of creedal, ideology, in terms of theology, is very much what Ibn Abdul Wahhab propagated. There are technical differences here and there, but the Saudis or the Wahhabis would say that we are Salafis because we emulate the first 3 generations of Muslims. So don't call us Wahhabis, call us Salafis. So that's why the Salafi clerics always claim to be Salafis and not Wahhabis. So it's only their detractors who would bestow the label Wahhabis on Saudis and other Salafi clerics. So I hope that answered your question. It's a massive literature on the differences. I think David Cummins talked about it extensively.
Thank you, Raihan. So Anita West has just slipped into my DMs to raise her hand. So Anita, you're unmuted.
Thanks. I've learned how to use chat. I actually applauded you before when you finished, but I don't know how to, I've never figured out how to raise my hand, though my students do it all the time. But I actually have a question that I raised in the chat much earlier, and the question is more about it's not the differences in their optic on jihad in these different groups, but more about the relative differences in affecting societies becoming considerably more closed and rigid. I don't understand the relative differences between these three types of groups and how they engage with societies. And I'd love to hear you talk about that. I mean, Wahhab, you know, the Quietists, Salafi, I mean, do they, you know, in an ideal sense, Salafi Islam would not close itself off to other religion, I mean, to closing out other religions or other peoples. I mean, because to me, that's against Islam. And Salafi Islam is supposed to be the quintessential Islam. So if you could talk about the relative differences between the groups you were talking about and how they socially engage with societies.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Someone like Muhammad Abdu would be considered as a Salafi, but enlightened Salafi, although he never actually used the term Salafi. And that has changed because we go back to 1924, Rashid Rida became more conservative and he established relations with Muhammad ibn Saud, or Ibn Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. So I think what happens is that gradually, and this is something that I cover in the book, gradually, Salafi clerics who lean towards more conservative interpretation of Salafism, promoted a collective interpretation of Salafism. And Saudi Arabia became the center of Salafism because people would, travel to Saudi Arabia, study in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi clerics who went to Saudi Arabia would travel back to Egypt, and some of them stayed in Saudi Arabia and became prominent members of the Board of Senior Clerics, for example. So they come back, they establish associations in Egypt and promote a similar interpretation that the Saudis would advocate. They have a lot of respect for muftis of Saudi Arabia, particularly Ibn Baz, Ibn Uthaymeen. So in Kuwait is very similar as well. I mean, the founder of Kuwaiti Salafism, initially Egyptian, traveled to Saudi Arabia, studied in Saudi Arabia, and then migrated to Kuwait and established the Salafi Association in Kuwait. So I think we're looking at a network of clerics promoting a collective interpretation of Islam. The reason they became prominent is, of course, with Saudi Arabia, you can't escape that. But in Egypt, for example, because of the funding that they get from Saudi Arabia, they're able to preach, publish widely in Egypt, and Kuwait is the same as well. In Kuwait, you have Salafi clerics who have managed to gain support from the merchant class in Kuwait to actually propagate Salafism. So the way I'm looking at this, I'm looking at what they preach. So it's very similar on many issues. On social issues, for example, they preach a collective Salafi identity. Issues such as the empowerment of women or allowing women to work, they deal with these issues, and it's transnational the way they deal with these issues. So Salafi clerics in Egypt and Kuwait would issue religious rulings in support of the Saudi religious establishment in terms of banning women from driving. And that's not an issue in Egypt or Kuwait, but is the idea of promoting this collective Salafi identity. Having said that, there are differences as well. And this is where it's so dynamic when we look at Salafism, because some clerics do not subscribe to social conservatism, and they feel that they need to challenge and push boundaries. Someone like Hatem al-Auni, that I've mentioned earlier, says that women can go out and work. Women should be allowed to drive. I would allow my daughters to drive, for example. So you have Salafi clerics who are, on the periphery, trying to push boundaries and challenge Salafi ideals. But because of petrodollar, because of Saudi Arabia's ability to gather students and clerics, educate them through the Saudi system, these clerics would go home and propagate this collective Salafi identity. And this is where I think it's fascinating when Oz asked earlier about Wahhabism and differences between Wahhabism and Salafism. I think, and I would argue and strongly argue, that when it comes to Salafism today, it's not the Muhammad Abdu's interpretation of Islam. Salafi clerics try to create and foster this collective community, the collective Salafi identity, and that's why it's pretty interesting. And the way they're doing it is transnational through networks of clerics. Salafi satellite channels, conferences, websites, endorsing each other on Twitter. They're self-promoters, really. So if a cleric in Kuwait issues a tweet and an activist believes in the same tweet, they will retweet each other and support each other's interpretation of certain issues.
Fabulous, thank you. So next we've got a question from Maher.
Hello, Raihan, and thank you very much for your talk. I just wondered if it's useful when we look at, you talked about Saudi Arabia being the official face of Salafism. I wonder if it's useful to talk about Salafism as an ideology that's fractured along national lines in the way that we talk about, for example, Ba'athism in Syria and Iraq, or whether China or the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, is the proper representative of what it is to be a communist state. But I wanted to ask you, you talked about how basically ISIS sometimes even rejects other jihadi sort of ulama. And I think that there's a problem here, which is that basically ISIS its theology is whatever it needs it to be at a certain time, whereas the Salafists are trying to create a coherent theology. But I wondered, is it just that in contact with things like, I wondered what their position was on something like, for example, Sunni militancy in Iraq. Because in Iraq, it's not a straightforward matter for them to oppose the government. So I just wondered, in a real life case where it's complicated, do they fracture along national lines or not? I mean, what happens there?
Well, thank you so much, Maria. That's an excellent question. I think I will attempt to answer your first question on the fragmentation of Salafism along national lines. I think I use a lot of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Egypt as examples. Saudi Arabia is an interesting case study, and I think because of Mohammed ibn Salman, the Salafi scenes have changed dramatically in Saudi Arabia. So Salafi clerics in Saudi Arabia are becoming more nationalist because they have to toe the government line and very supportive of the Saudi state. Muhammad al-Arifi, who was a prominent activist, very supportive of jihad in Saudi Arabia, controversial figure, but very popular, came out in support of the Saudi state when the Saudi state decided to boycott Qatar. And this is despite the fact that he had excellent relations with the Emir of Qatar and other Salafi clerics in Qatar. So we're looking at domestic circumstances and how Salafi clerics are forced to change based on their domestic circumstances and what they're going through. A number of clerics have actually changed their positions to demonstrate loyalty to the state. I mean, maybe because they're scared, maybe it's all about self-preservation, but I think it is very different. And in the context of Kuwait, it's also very different because of the different political system in Kuwait. So Salafi Quietists in Kuwait, despite the fact that they're Quietists, they participate in the Kuwaiti elections. So because to them, we have to manage our domestic circumstances despite the fact that we propagate or try to promote a collective Salafi identity. And that is more or less appreciated. I think your second question, I hope I've answered your first question. The second question and the idea of not supportive of ISIS, absolutely. Most Salafi clerics do not endorse ISIS at all because it's seen as too distinct from Salafism. But when it comes to Jabhat al-Nusra, Salafi clerics were divided. Someone like Hamid al-Ali would say, maybe it's okay. Omar al-Zaid in Saudi Arabia, despite being a Quietist, he argued that it's okay to send money to Jabhat al-Nusra. We have to support Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra is very different from Al-Qaeda. And again, they're looking at the circumstances of the day. I mean, the Syrian conflict, particularly the early stages of the civil war, Jabhat al-Nusra performed really well, and Salafi clerics were divided. Some were not sure, and they thought that, these guys are fighting the Assad regime. Why are we speaking out against them? The Saudi state is supportive of the Sunni revolutionaries, and therefore we have to be very careful. It's only after the rise of ISIS, the establishment of the caliphate, the international scrutiny on funding, foreign fighters traveling to Iraq and Syria, that's when most of these clerics retracted or resiled their earlier positions because of pressure, international pressure, but also domestic pressures. So most of the Salafi clerics on the issue of Jabhat al-Nusra and other armed groups in Syria, I don't look at Iraq very much, I look at Syria a lot. Armed groups in Syria, they're very supportive of certain, armed factions in Syria. And in fact, some of them have actually traveled to Syria to fight with certain groups. The militant hierarchies in particular, they're part of the hierarchy network, they're not part of the jihadi networks, but the Syrian conflict changed the way they deal and engage with militant groups. Shaf al-Ajmi, who's an a Kuwaiti cleric, traveled to Syria, and he said that I traveled to Syria, I brought my children with me, and I think it is our responsibility to support Syrians. And Jabhat al-Nusra, they're not bad, they're actually fighting Hezbollah. So I think it's definitely more tricky. I cover that in the chapter, so I hope I'm be able to do it justice.
You just have to read your chapter, Raihan.
Hopefully.
I am mindful of the time. We have time for one last question.
We've got one question from Nadine.
Okay.
Hello. So my question is not too different from Mara's question. So basically, I was wondering, Raihan, if you think that in different political contexts, as you just explained, in different political contexts, the Salafis have different reactions and we see the divisions. So is the question should we focus on the very idea of the theological differences between these traditions, or should we look at the political systems and maybe mobilize more democratic values such as open deliberation and whatnot to actually lead the way into de-radicalizing jihadism?
I think, again, that's a very good question, Nadine. It's very difficult in dealing with Salafi theology. I think when it comes to Salafi theology, it's easy. It's not that hard for them to debunk ISIS. Salafi clerics very well versed in Salafi theology. Some of them, they reinterpret Salafism, and it's a matter of interpretation. So they're able to construct an excellent narrative against ISIS. But I think in the region, at least this is my opinion, I'm not, I don't work on countering violent extremism, but I think there are other factors that would contribute to radicalization in the region. You can use, excellent arguments against ISIS, but if you're not able to engage and deal with existing grievances that these Salafis or jihadis have, it's going to be very difficult to counter the influence of jihadi Salafism. The theological arguments are not that strong. It is often the political argument that they use to mobilize support that's actually galvanizes anti-government sentiments. Anti-US sentiments, and they have a legitimate concern where they talk about the Iraq invasion. And if you look, I'm trying to familiarize myself with the ISIS propaganda material. It's not really about Salafi theology so much that they focus on. It's more that the grievances, the killings, the murders of innocent Muslims in the hands of tyrannical regimes. So I think and that's an issue. Of course, the theology is important, and Salafi clerics have spoken out against ISIS. They've denounced the caliphate. As soon as ISIS declared Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the caliphate, a number of Salafi clerics, including Quietists and Harakis, easily denounced the caliphate by saying that it's not representative. Someone like Umar al-Zayd from Saudi Arabia, a Quietist cleric, dedicated lectures talking about the caliphate. He received death threats from ISIS through WhatsApp and also other social media platforms. Muhammad al-Arifi also received threats from ISIS militants. So they are actively engaging and speaking out against jihadi Salafism, but coming from a non-jihadi or radicalization expert, I think there are definitely more issues that would galvanize and mobilize people to support jihadi groups.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Halim? Halim, are you there? Doesn't sound like it. All right, well, this was a wonderful webinar, Raihan. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us as part of the MESEF webinar program. I should, since I have everyone here, I have a captive audience here. I should tell everyone that we are going to have another webinar on the 18th of June at 5 p.m. Australian time, and it's probably 11 a.m. in Abu Dhabi at that time. Our speaker is Dr. Jonathan Fulton from Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, talking to us about China's interest in the Gulf region and managing Iran tension with the Gulf monarchies. So I hope you can join us. We will send out notification. If you're on our mailing list, you will receive it. Now, getting back to our esteemed speaker of the day, Dr. Raihan Ismail, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I think Dara is going to unmute everybody, or maybe I can, so we can all clap. Thank you so much, Raihan.
Thank you, Raihan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
And